In the last video, you discovered the story of the man considered the founder of the organization. But what few people know is that the person who truly shaped Jehovah's Witnesses as we know them today was another man entirely. He was a lawyer, ambitious, and divided leadership with a pen. Literally. The year was 1916. Charles Taze Russell, the charismatic founder of what would become Jehovah's Witnesses, lay dying in a train car crossing the American Midwest. As his life ebbed away, a power vacuum opened that would forever change the destiny of millions of believers worldwide. Standing in the shadows, ready to seize control, was a man whose legal mind and ruthless ambition would transform a loose collection of Bible students into one of the most centralized religious organizations on earth. This is the story of Joseph Franklin Rutherford, the ambitious lawyer who didn't just inherit a movement, but completely rebuilt it in his own image. Joseph Franklin Rutherford was born on November 8, 1869, in Morgan County, Missouri, into a world far removed from the religious fervor that would later define his life. The son of a Baptist farmer, young Joseph displayed an intellectual hunger that set him apart from his rural surroundings. While other farm boys content themselves with seasonal rhythms of planting and harvest, Rutherford devoured books, showing particular aptitude for argument and persuasion. By age 22, he had taught himself law and passed the Missouri bar exam, an impressive feat in an era when formal legal education was still a luxury. He established a practice in Boonville, Missouri, where his sharp tongue and sharper mind quickly earned him a reputation as a formidable courtroom opponent. Colleagues knew him as Judge Rutherford, a title he acquired during his brief stint as a substitute judge, though he would carry it for the rest of his life like a badge of honor. But Rutherford was not content with small-town legal practice. He possessed the kind of restless ambition that viewed every situation as an opportunity for advancement, every relationship as a potential stepping stone. When he first encountered the teachings of Charles Taze Russell around 1894, it wasn't necessarily divine inspiration that drew him in, it was opportunity. Russell's movement was growing rapidly, but it lacked something crucial: legal sophistication. The Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, Russell's publishing arm, faced constant legal challenges from disgruntled followers, copyright disputes, and the complex mechanics of managing an international religious organization. Russell, for all his charisma and theological innovation, was essentially a self-taught preacher trying to navigate an increasingly complex legal landscape. Enter Rutherford, with his legal expertise and hungry ambition. He didn't just join Russell's movement, he made himself indispensable to it. Rutherford's rise within Russell's organization was a masterclass in corporate maneuvering disguised as religious devotion. He began by offering his legal services pro bono, helping the society navigate various lawsuits and regulatory challenges. But Rutherford was playing a longer game, positioning himself not just as Russell's lawyer, but as his heir apparent. In 1907, Rutherford was appointed as the society's legal counsel, a position that gave him unprecedented access to the organization's inner workings. He understood better than anyone how power truly flowed within the society, not through spiritual authority alone, but through legal control of assets, publishing rights, and corporate governance. While Russell traveled the world preaching to adoring crowds, Rutherford worked tirelessly behind the scenes, restructuring the organization's legal framework. He carefully studied the society's charter and bylaws, identifying every lever of power, every potential vulnerability. Like a chess player thinking 10 moves ahead, he positioned himself to capitalize on any future opportunity. That opportunity came sooner than anyone expected. The death of a prophet. October 31, 1916. Charles Taze Russell, age 64, died suddenly while traveling by train from Los Angeles to New York. His death sent shockwaves through the Bible student movement, leaving thousands of followers worldwide wondering what would happen to their spiritual leader's legacy. Russell had been more than just a teacher to his followers. He was their prophet, their guide through the maze of biblical prophecy and end-time speculation. Many believed he was the faithful and wise servant, mentioned in Matthew 24 verse 45, specially chosen by God to provide spiritual food to his people. His death created not just a leadership vacuum, but a theological crisis. According to Russell's will and the Society's charter, control of the organization should have passed to the board of directors, with decisions made collectively rather than by a single individual. This was in keeping with Russell's stated philosophy that no man should wield absolute authority over God's people. But Rutherford had other plans. What happened next was a display of legal maneuvering so audacious, so carefully planned, that it could only have been orchestrated by someone with Rutherford's particular combination of legal expertise and ruthless ambition. Within days of Russell's death, Rutherford convened a special meeting of the Watchtower Society's board of directors. Using his intimate knowledge of the organization's legal structure, he argued that Russell's will was invalid in certain key respects, and that the society's charter actually gave the president, a position Rutherford maneuvered himself into, far more authority than previously understood. The details of Rutherford's legal arguments were complex, involving arcane points of Pennsylvania corporate law and creative interpretations of the society's founding documents. But the effect was simple. Within weeks of Russell's death, Rutherford had consolidated virtually all power in the organization under his personal control. Several board members objected, arguing that this centralization of authority violated both Russell's wishes and the society's founding principles. They pointed out that Russell had explicitly warned against allowing any single individual to gain absolute control over the organization. Rutherford's response was swift and decisive. In July 1917, he engineered the removal of 4 dissenting board members, replacing them with loyal supporters. When the displaced directors protested, Rutherford used his legal expertise to outmaneuver them at every turn, tying up their challenges in complex legal proceedings they couldn't afford to pursue. It was a corporate coup disguised as religious necessity, executed with surgical precision by a man who understood that in modern religious organizations, legal authority often trumps spiritual authority. With his position secure, Rutherford began implementing changes that would fundamentally transform Russell's movement. But he moved carefully at first, understanding that too much change too quickly might provoke rebellion among Russell's longtime followers. His first major innovation was organizational. Where Russell had led through personal charisma and individual Bible study, Rutherford began implementing systematic, centralized control. He established clear hierarchies, standardized procedures, and created mechanisms for ensuring that his authority reached every corner of the organization. The change was subtle but profound. Under Russell, local congregations of Bible students had enjoyed considerable autonomy, studying Russell's writings but interpreting them through their own local leadership. Under Rutherford, this decentralized approach was gradually replaced by a top-down system where doctrine, practice, and even local leadership appointments flowed from headquarters. Rutherford also understood the power of media in ways that Russell, for all his publishing success, had never fully grasped. He invested heavily in radio broadcasting, eventually operating one of the most powerful radio networks in America. But where Russell had used media primarily to spread his teachings, Rutherford used it to build a cult of personality around his own leadership. His radio programs didn't just teach Bible doctrine. They consistently reinforced the message that faithful Christians must submit to the authority of God's organization, as represented by Rutherford himself. It was a subtle but crucial shift, from following Christ through Bible study to following Christ through organizational obedience. By the late 1920s, Rutherford was ready for his most audacious move yet, completely rebranding Russell's movement. The Bible students, as Russell's followers had called themselves, carried too much historical baggage. The name connected them to Russell's legacy and to the decentralized, study-based approach that Rutherford was systematically dismantling. In 1931, at a convention in Columbus, Ohio, Rutherford announced that henceforth, the organization would be known as Jehovah's Witnesses. The new name, he explained, was based on Isaiah 43 verses 10 to 12, where God's people are called his witnesses. But the name change was about more than biblical accuracy. It was a masterstroke of organizational psychology. Bible students, suggested individuals engaged in personal study and interpretation. Jehovah's Witnesses suggested a unified group with a specific mission, bound together by divine appointment rather than mere human association. The rebranding allowed Rutherford to accomplish several goals simultaneously. It distanced the organization from Russell's legacy, making it easier to implement doctrinal changes that contradicted Russell's teachings. It created a stronger sense of group identity and exclusivity among followers. And it positioned Rutherford not as Russell's successor, but as the leader of something entirely new. The psychological impact on followers was profound. Many who might have questioned changes to Russell's teachings found themselves swept up in the excitement of being part of God's newly identified witness organization. Rutherford had transformed what could have been a liability, breaking with the founder's teachings, into an asset, participating in God's progressive revelation. Perhaps Rutherford's most significant innovation was theological, the development of what would become known as the faithful and discreet slave doctrine. This teaching, refined and systematized during Rutherford's presidency, held that God was using a specific earthly organization, the Watchtower Society, to provide spiritual guidance to his people. Under Russell, the faithful and wise servant of Matthew 24 verse 45 had been interpreted as Russell himself, or sometimes as all faithful Christians collectively. But Rutherford reinterpreted this passage to refer to the Watchtower organization as an institution, with himself as its earthly representative. This doctrinal innovation was brilliant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. It meant that questioning the organization's teachings wasn't just disagreeing with human interpretation, it was rebelling against God's appointed channel of communication. It transformed organizational loyalty from a practical necessity into a spiritual requirement. The doctrine also provided theological justification for the centralized authority structure Rutherford had been building. Local congregations weren't just administratively connected to headquarters, they were spiritually dependent on it. Independent Bible study wasn't just discouraged. It was potentially dangerous, since individuals might reach conclusions that contradicted the organization's official teachings. Rutherford reinforced this message through a relentless publishing campaign. The Watchtower magazine, under his editorship, consistently emphasized themes of organizational loyalty, submission to authority, and the dangers of independent thinking. His books, distributed by the millions, portrayed the Watchtower Society as humanity's only hope for spiritual salvation. Another of Rutherford's revolutionary changes was the institutionalization of door-to-door preaching. While Russell had encouraged his followers to share their beliefs, this sharing was largely voluntary and took many forms: personal conversations, letter writing, public speaking, and informal Bible studies. Rutherford transformed this voluntary witness work into a mandatory religious obligation. He established quotas for preaching hours, standardized presentations, and systematic record-keeping. What had been spontaneous spiritual sharing became organized evangelical campaigns. The change reflected Rutherford's broader philosophy of organizational efficiency. He understood that requiring regular preaching activity served multiple purposes beyond simply spreading the organization's message. It kept members busy and focused on organizational activities. It created regular opportunities for indoctrination and reinforcement of organizational teachings. And it established a clear metric for measuring spiritual devotion: those who preached more were more faithful, while those who preached less were spiritually weak. Rutherford also recognized the psychological power of public commitment. When Jehovah's Witnesses went door-to-door defending their beliefs, they weren't just teaching others, they were reinforcing their own commitment to the organization. Each conversation with a skeptical householder, each defense of organizational teachings, deepened their psychological investment in the group. The door-to-door ministry became one of Jehovah's Witnesses' most distinctive features, but it also served as a powerful mechanism for organizational control. Members who wanted to remain in good standing had little choice but to participate, regardless of their personal inclinations or abilities. Not everyone embraced Rutherford's transformation of Russell's movement. By the early 1920s, significant opposition had emerged among longtime Bible students who felt that Rutherford was betraying Russell's legacy and concentrating too much power in his own hands. The opposition centered around several key figures who had been close to Russell and held positions of authority within the organization. They objected to Rutherford's authoritarian leadership style, his doctrinal innovations, and his systematic dismantling of the democratic elements Russell had built into the organization's structure. Rutherford's response to this opposition revealed the full extent of his ruthless ambition. Rather than engage in theological debate or seek compromise, he launched what can only be described as a systematic purge of dissenting voices. Using his control over the organization's communication channels, Rutherford portrayed the opposition as spiritually unfaithful, motivated by pride and personal ambition rather than genuine concern for biblical truth. He questioned their motives, their character, and their spiritual standing before God. The purge was methodical and comprehensive. Dissenting board members were removed. Local leaders who questioned Rutherford's authority were stripped of their positions. Entire congregations that refused to accept the new direction were cut off from the organization. Perhaps most tellingly, Rutherford made no effort to win back the dissenting groups through persuasion or compromise. He seemed to view the split not as an unfortunate division, but as a beneficial separation of the truly faithful from the spiritually weak. This attitude would become characteristic of the organization under his leadership. Absolute loyalty was required, and those who couldn't provide it were better off leaving. The human cost of Rutherford's purge was enormous. Families were divided as some members followed Rutherford while others remained loyal to Russell's original teachings. Friendships that had been forged through decades of shared Bible study were destroyed by doctrinal disputes and organizational politics. Entire communities of believers were torn apart by conflicts over authority and interpretation. As Rutherford consolidated his control over the organization, he began developing what can only be described as a personality cult around his own leadership. This development was particularly striking given Russell's repeated warnings about the dangers of following human leaders rather than Christ. Rutherford's photographs appeared prominently in Watchtower publications. His writings were quoted as authoritatively as Scripture itself. His personal opinions on everything from politics to diet became organizational doctrine. Members were encouraged to view him not just as their organizational leader, but as God's specially chosen representative on earth. The cult of personality extended to Rutherford's lifestyle as well. While ordinary Jehovah's Witnesses were encouraged to live simply and focus on spiritual rather than material concerns, Rutherford lived lavishly. He maintained multiple residences, traveled in style, and surrounded himself with the trappings of wealth and power. This contradiction between the organization's stated values and its leader's lifestyle would have been scandalous in most religious groups. But Rutherford had so successfully established his authority as divinely appointed that criticism became virtually impossible. Members who might have questioned his lifestyle were made to feel that such questioning revealed their own spiritual weakness rather than legitimate concerns about leadership accountability. The personality cult also manifested in Rutherford's writing style and public presentations. Where Russell had been relatively humble in his claims about his own authority, Rutherford wrote and spoke with absolute confidence, presenting his interpretations as direct revelations from God. He brooked no disagreement and showed no uncertainty, projecting an image of infallible leadership that many followers found both reassuring and intimidating. Under Rutherford's leadership, the Watchtower Society evolved from a relatively modest publishing operation into a massive business enterprise. The organization's publishing activities expanded dramatically, with books, magazines, and pamphlets distributed by the millions worldwide. But Rutherford understood that the organization's real asset wasn't its literature, it was its army of unpaid volunteers. Every Jehovah's Witness who went door to door was essentially a commissioned salesperson, distributing the organization's publications and recruiting new members. The business model was brilliant in its simplicity. Use religious devotion to motivate massive voluntary labor forces that generated both revenue and growth. The financial arrangements were particularly ingenious. Local congregations were expected to purchase literature from headquarters, then distribute it in their communities. Members who couldn't afford to purchase literature outright were encouraged to take it on consignment, paying for it only after they had placed it with householders. This system ensured steady cash flow to headquarters while making individual members financially invested in the organization's success. Rutherford also expanded the organization's real estate holdings, acquiring properties around the world that served as branch offices, assembly halls, and printing facilities. These properties were typically acquired through donations from members, but ownership remained with the central organization rather than local congregations. The business empire Rutherford built was remarkably centralized and efficient. Local congregations had virtually no financial autonomy. All major expenditures required approval from headquarters. This financial control reinforced the organizational authority structure Rutherford had established, making it virtually impossible for local groups to operate independently even if they wanted to. One of Rutherford's most significant challenges was dealing with the legacy of Russell's failed prophecies. Russell had confidently predicted that 1914 would mark the end of the current world system and the beginning of Christ's earthly kingdom. When 1914 came and went without the predicted apocalypse, Russell had adjusted his timeline, suggesting that the events of 1914 marked the beginning of the end rather than the end itself. But by the 1920s, it was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain that the end was imminent when more than a decade had passed since the supposed beginning of the final period. Rutherford needed to find a way to maintain the organization's sense of urgency while explaining why Russell's specific predictions had not been fulfilled. His solution was characteristically audacious. Rather than admit error, he reinterpreted Russell's prophecies as having been spiritually rather than physically fulfilled. The events of 1914, according to Rutherford's new interpretation, had indeed marked the beginning of Christ's kingdom, but this kingdom was established in heaven, not on earth. The physical manifestation of Christ's rule would come later, at a time that only God knew. This reinterpretation served several purposes. It preserved Russell's reputation as a prophet while giving Rutherford flexibility to make new predictions. It maintained the organization's apocalyptic urgency while explaining why the apocalypse hadn't yet occurred. And it established a pattern of prophetic reinterpretation that would allow the organization to survive future prophetic failures. Rutherford also introduced new prophetic expectations to replace Russell's failed predictions. He confidently proclaimed that the Great Tribulation would begin soon, followed by the Battle of Armageddon and the establishment of God's kingdom on earth. These predictions created the same sense of urgency that Russell's prophecies had generated, while being vague enough to allow for future reinterpretation if necessary. By the end of the 1920s, Rutherford had successfully transformed Russell's Bible student movement into something entirely different. The loose confederation of independent study groups had become a highly centralized, authoritarian organization. The emphasis on individual Bible study had been replaced by organizational obedience. The democratic elements Russell had built into the structure had been eliminated in favor of top-down control. But this transformation came at an enormous cost. Thousands of Russell's original followers refused to accept Rutherford's changes and left the organization. These departing members didn't simply disappear. Many formed independent Bible student groups that continued to follow Russell's original teachings and organizational methods. The split was particularly painful because it divided families and communities that had been united by their shared faith. Parents found themselves estranged from children who chose different sides in the organizational conflict. Spouses sometimes found themselves worshiping in different groups. Friendships that had lasted decades were destroyed by doctrinal disputes and competing loyalties. Rutherford showed little concern for these human costs. From his perspective, the split was beneficial because it separated the truly faithful from those who lacked complete commitment to God's organization. He actively discouraged his followers from maintaining contact with departing members, characterizing such contact as spiritually dangerous. This attitude toward dissent and division would become one of the defining characteristics of the organization under Rutherford's leadership. Unity was valued above all else, but unity was defined as complete agreement with organizational teachings and absolute submission to organizational authority. Those who couldn't provide such agreement and submission were viewed not as sincere Christians with different interpretations, but as enemies of God's work. Rutherford's leadership style combined religious authority with corporate efficiency in ways that were both innovative and troubling. He understood that modern religious organizations couldn't rely solely on spiritual persuasion. They needed systematic methods for ensuring compliance and preventing dissent. Under his leadership, the organization developed sophisticated mechanisms for monitoring and controlling member behavior. Local congregations were required to submit regular reports on their activities, including detailed information about individual members' participation in preaching work, meeting attendance, and spiritual progress. Members who failed to meet organizational expectations faced a graduated series of consequences, from informal counseling to formal disciplinary action to complete expulsion from the group. The threat of shunning, complete social isolation from family and friends within the organization, proved to be an extraordinarily effective tool for maintaining conformity. Rutherford also understood the importance of controlling information flow within the organization. Members were strongly discouraged from reading materials that contradicted organizational teachings, including publications by former members or independent Bible students. The organization's own publications became virtually the only acceptable source of spiritual guidance, creating an information bubble that made it difficult for members to encounter alternative perspectives. These control mechanisms were presented not as authoritarian restrictions, but as loving provisions from God's organization designed to protect members from spiritual contamination. The language of spiritual protection masked what was essentially a comprehensive system of thought control. Rutherford's ambitions extended far beyond the American religious landscape. He envisioned a global organization that would carry his interpretation of biblical truth to every corner of the earth. Under his leadership, the Watchtower Society launched aggressive missionary campaigns throughout Europe, Asia, Africa, and South America. The international expansion was carefully planned and methodically executed. Rutherford established branch offices in major cities worldwide, each staffed with loyal representatives who understood his vision for centralized control. These branch offices served as both administrative centers and training facilities, ensuring that the organization's message remained consistent regardless of local cultural differences. But the expansion also created new challenges. Different countries had different laws regarding religious organizations, different cultural attitudes toward authority, and different theological traditions. Rutherford's response to these challenges revealed the full extent of his commitment to organizational uniformity. Rather than adapting the organization's methods to local conditions, Rutherford insisted that foreign branches conform to the same centralized structure he had established in America. Local customs, traditional religious practices, and cultural sensitivities were all subordinated to organizational consistency. The result was an international religious movement that was remarkably uniform but often culturally tone-deaf. The international expansion also intensified the organization's apocalyptic message. Rutherford argued that the worldwide spread of Jehovah's Witnesses was itself a fulfillment of biblical prophecy, proving that the end of the current world system was imminent. This circular reasoning, organizational growth, proved the message was true, and the true message naturally produced organizational growth, became a cornerstone of the organization's self-validation. By the late 1930s, Rutherford had achieved everything he had set out to accomplish. The organization he had inherited from Russell bore almost no resemblance to its founder's original vision. Where Russell had led a loose confederation of independent Bible students, Rutherford commanded a tightly controlled international corporation. Where Russell had encouraged individual study and interpretation, Rutherford demanded unquestioning acceptance of organizational doctrine. The transformation was complete, but it had come at an enormous personal cost to Rutherford himself. The years of constant conflict, the stress of maintaining absolute control over a growing organization, and the burden of living up to his own inflated claims about divine authority had taken their toll. His health began to deteriorate, and his public appearances became less frequent. Even in decline, however, Rutherford refused to share power or prepare for succession in any meaningful way. He had spent decades concentrating authority in his own person, and he seemed incapable of imagining the organization functioning without his direct control. The irony was palpable. A man who had criticized Russell for failing to prepare adequate leadership succession had made the same mistake himself. Rutherford's final years were marked by increasing isolation and paranoia. He trusted fewer and fewer people, suspected disloyalty everywhere, and became increasingly hostile toward anyone who showed signs of independent thinking. The organization that had once attracted members through the promise of spiritual freedom had become a prison of conformity, with Rutherford as both its architect and its primary prisoner. Joseph Franklin Rutherford died on January 8, 1942, at his California residence called Beth Sarim. His death marked the end of an era, but his influence on Jehovah's Witnesses would prove to be permanent and profound. Every major characteristic of the modern organization, its centralized authority structure, its emphasis on door-to-door preaching, its claim to be God's exclusive earthly representative, its intolerance of dissent, can be traced directly to innovations Rutherford implemented during his presidency. Perhaps most significantly, Rutherford had solved the fundamental problem that faces all charismatic religious movements: how to institutionalize charisma. Russell's movement had been built around his personal authority and would likely have fragmented after his death without strong institutional structures. Rutherford created those structures, but at the cost of transforming a voluntary association of Bible students into an authoritarian religious corporation. The methods Rutherford used to consolidate power, legal maneuvering, purges of dissenting voices, information control, and the creation of a personality cult became permanent features of the organization's culture. Future leaders would inherit not just his position, but his playbook for maintaining absolute control. The human cost of Rutherford's transformation cannot be calculated. Families were divided, friendships destroyed, and entire communities torn apart by the conflicts he initiated. Thousands of sincere believers who had found spiritual meaning in Russell's teachings were forced to choose between their conscience and their community. Many chose conscience and found themselves shunned by people they had considered family. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of Rutherford's legacy was the way he perverted the very concept of spiritual authority. By claiming that organizational loyalty was equivalent to faithfulness to God, he made it virtually impossible for members to distinguish between human leadership and divine guidance. The result was a form of spiritual abuse disguised as religious devotion. As we examine Rutherford's transformation of Russell's movement, certain questions emerge that the official organizational history has never adequately addressed. How much of Rutherford's motivation was genuine religious conviction, and how much was simple ambition for power and control? Did he truly believe he was God's chosen representative, or was he a cynical manipulator who used religious authority to satisfy his own ego? The evidence suggests a complex mixture of both. Rutherford clearly believed in the basic framework of Russell's teachings about biblical prophecy and the approaching end of the world. But he also showed a remarkable willingness to modify, reinterpret, or abandoned those teachings whenever they conflicted with his organizational goals. His lifestyle also raises troubling questions about his true motivations. While preaching sacrifice and simple living to his followers, Rutherford lived in luxury that would have been scandalous in most religious organizations. His expensive cars, multiple residences, and lavish entertaining suggested a man more concerned with worldly success than spiritual simplicity. Perhaps most tellingly, Rutherford showed no interest in preparing for the possibility that his prophecies might be wrong. Unlike Russell, who had genuinely wrestled with the implications of his failed predictions, Rutherford simply moved on to new predictions without acknowledging previous errors. This pattern suggests a leader more concerned with maintaining authority than with discovering truth. The changes Rutherford implemented went far beyond organizational structure and religious doctrine. He fundamentally altered the psychological relationship between individual members and their faith community. Under Russell, Bible students had been encouraged to make the truth their own through personal study and reflection. Under Rutherford, such independent thinking became not just discouraged but dangerous. This transformation had profound implications for the spiritual development of individual members. Where Russell's approach had fostered intellectual curiosity and personal growth, Rutherford's system rewarded conformity and punished questions. The result was a form of arrested spiritual development where members remained perpetually dependent on organizational guidance rather than developing their own relationship with God. The psychological mechanisms Rutherford employed were sophisticated and effective. By creating a closed information system where organizational publications were the only acceptable source of spiritual truth, he made it virtually impossible for members to encounter alternative perspectives. By establishing a graduated system of privileges and punishments based on organizational loyalty, he created powerful incentives for conformity. Perhaps most insidiously, Rutherford redefined doubt itself as a spiritual weakness rather than a natural part of the search for truth. Members who experienced questions about organizational teachings were made to feel that such questions revealed their own lack of faith rather than legitimate concerns about leadership or doctrine. Joseph Franklin Rutherford was undoubtedly one of the most significant religious figures of the 20th century, though his significance lies not in any theological innovations but in his genius for organizational control. He took a loose, voluntary association of Bible students and transformed it into one of the most centralized and authoritarian religious organizations in the modern world. His methods were often ruthless, his motivations questionable, and his impact on individual lives frequently devastating. But his effectiveness cannot be denied. The organization he created has survived for more than a century, weathering countless crises and continuing to grow despite practices that would destroy most voluntary associations. The tragedy of Rutherford's legacy is that he succeeded so completely in his transformation of Russell's movement that few modern Jehovah's Witnesses have any understanding of what the organization was like before his rise to power. The democratic elements, the intellectual freedom, and the emphasis on individual spiritual development that characterized Russell's Bible students have been so thoroughly erased that they might as well have never existed. Today's Jehovah's Witnesses live in the world that Rutherford created, a world where organizational loyalty is the highest virtue, where questioning authority is the greatest sin, and where spiritual growth is measured by conformity to organizational expectations rather than personal relationship with God. It is a world that would have been completely foreign to Charles Taze Russell, but it is precisely the world that Joseph Franklin Rutherford intended to create. But not everyone accepted these changes, and a silent division began to form, a split that would create ripple effects lasting to this day. In the next episode, you'll discover how thousands abandoned the organization and created parallel movements that still exist today, carrying forward the original vision that Rutherford worked so hard to destroy. The story of what happened to those who said no to Rutherford's transformation is a tale of conscience, courage, and the price of standing up to absolute authority. It's a story that reveals just how much was lost when one ambitious lawyer decided to change everything.